Hi, I'm Woo Young Chung, track producer for Track B. I'm delighted that you decided to join us for this session. Artificial intelligence has become a very critical, important topic in our field. But artificial intelligence in real time? Today, in this session, our distinguished panelists will discuss exactly that topic. Without further ado, I turn it over to Jim.
Right, thank you so much. So this is Jim Short. I'm one of the conference chairs and moderator for this session. I'd like to introduce the topic very quickly and make a connection to those of you joining. Thank you very much for joining this session. So we're in session B, and the previous session at 11B was a gentleman from OneTrust who talked a lot about different technologies that were implicit in the governance and compliance dimension. And at the end of that, his talk discussed some of the dynamic or artificial AI-enabled classification and data governance policies. And that was a very nice lead in to our session, which is looking at the question, looking at the topic of assessing our state of readiness for artificial intelligence. We read about it. We know it's actually, for those of you old enough, you remember that this is a couple of times, at least the third time we've talked about AI. We used to call it expert systems and so forth. And the topic now is broadening and becoming more inclusive in terms of how it looks at different technologies. So in organizing this, and I'm going to introduce each of the panelists at the beginning very quickly, so that they can just give you a heads up on what they're going to be covering. But in organizing this, we thought we would have a three-part discussion. The first is Steve Orrin from Intel, who's going to look at the technology side of this. The second speaker is Naguib Attia from IBM, who's looked at a kind of comprehensive idea around the software environment that is going to surround these technologies. And Simmi Bhargava from Adobe is going to look at the organizational question, which of course is how you actually get an organization to utilize and effectively measure the output from these systems. So that's kind of the scope of the session. And with that, I'd like to introduce Steve Orrin. Steve, you want to just pop on here for a second and say hello to everyone, and they'll then go to Naguib.
Great, and thanks for having us here today. I'm looking forward to a lively discussion on real-time AI. Thank you, Jim.
So Dr. Attia, would you like to say hello to everyone and just
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm really looking forward for this great session, and I have a very fruitful discussion too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Naguib. Simmi, you also want to say hello to the audience, and then we'll stay tuned since you're our closing speaker on the panel. But over to you.
Right. Now, either it's the best for last or something, I don't know, but it's a pleasure to be here, and I hope to generate some thinking and some question and answers, and if we're hopefully able to provide a little bit of insight from our learnings. Thank you, Jim, and the organization for inviting us to this event.
Not at all. All right, so let me just, for those of you who are still joining, let me just identify, this is session 12B. In the track, we're going to be looking at artificial intelligence. We're going to drive right through it. I would like to thank everyone who's joined the session. Thank you all for joining. In particular, those of you in different time contexts. If you're in Europe, you're up late. And if you're in Asia, you're up really late or up really early, depending on which day it is. So I just want to thank everyone for joining, and we'll get going. So Steve, without further ado, your role is to kind of look at a landscape of the technologies that we're going to be discussing. And if I'm set up here, I will get the screen share going, and there we go. Okay, Steve.
Excellent.
You.
Thank you. And so, as Jim mentioned, the topic today is really about taking AI to that real-time state that we all want to get to. And we've seen evidence of in a variety of use cases. But the real question we want to start with is, are we really there yet? Do we have it pervasive? Just by way of introduction, and Jim, if you go to the next slide, I'm the federal CTO for Intel Corporation and drive our architecture and strategy across all technologies for the federal government and the broader public sector with a background on data science and cybersecurity. Finally, let's hit right into the next slide. Let's get to the meat of the matter. So let's start with where the architecture is today. We have what's generally called a data-centric architecture, edge to cloud. So you have various things, sensors, platforms, edge computing, performing functions in a variety of different industries that are leveraging services across the network and into the cloud or into the data center. And the kind of building blocks that you have, the functions that you have across these different domains, at the edge you have sensor data processing, oftentimes data fusion, some edge inferencing and edge insights, but it's still nascent as far as how much is really being done at the edge versus fully leveraging the cloud. We see this trend accelerating towards moving more towards the edge. To enable that, you need to have a network that can help deliver that connectivity, both at the edge and then back to the cloud. And so the access network, the core network, and then the evolution of 5G are really going to help enable that, to be able to do your classic data transmission, but also to do the peer and mesh computing and networking that's necessary to enable the edge and to enable that sensing. The edge network is also going to help create that situational awareness and deal with some of the dedicated, diffused, and disconnected and dislocated communication challenges that you have in the real world, whether it be from buildings to external, things crossing different communication domains or in communication denied environments. And so the edge and the core network are really going to have to be dynamic in order to enable that sort of complex edge computing scenario and to be able to get the data to the back end and then back again. Now, classically, we've looked at the data center and the cloud as doing things like the training and learning exercises, doing broad scale empirical analysis, predictive modeling, and in the future, and this coming up this year, later this year, exascale style computing and high performance computing. This is where we are today. This is sort of the classic approach that we see for deploying analytics and AI to the edge. But as we'll talk about in a lot more detail, the question isn't whether or not we can do AI, it's what do we need to do to get to real-time or near real-time AI? So Jim, if you move to the next slide, if we look at the vision of what it takes to be a real-time data-centric architecture, it adds a couple of things to the list, a lot of the same building blocks, but now we're doing a lot more at the edge, because in order to get to real time, we need to be able to make decisions and take those inferencings and those insights and apply them without worrying about the latency of getting results back from the cloud. And so you're going to see some of the same stuff on sensor data processing, but you're also going to see ingestion, because you're going to actually do learning and training at the edge. And that's one of the fundamental shifts that are going to truly enable real-time AI, real-time decisions, is where we're not completely dependent upon the cloud and the data center for all of our training and learning, for all of our AI improvement or AI enhancement. And so new models are on distributed and federated learning models, and sort of small data set learning techniques are all going to be absolutely crucial for us being able to get to delivering on decisions and insights in real time. It also means the network's got to evolve a bit. And so one of the things that really is interesting is that the network has to enable those edge devices to collaborate. Because in order to get to real time, you may not want to wait for the cloud. You may not want to wait for that connectivity or to send that much data back and forth. So you're going to be doing a lot more outcomes transmission and peer-to-peer and mesh style computing and networking. And then finally, you still are going to leverage the cloud, but instead of it being the all end-all be-all for all training and learning and all analytics, it's going to be leveraging more of the outcomes. And that's really a key distinction, is when you look at real-time AI, the backend is going to learn on the decisions that were made to improve those decisions and those models for the future, to do more predictive and even prescriptive modeling, and some of the cross-domain and temporal analytics. But a lot of the classical learning and the classical feedback learning will happen at the edge now. And that's some of the fundamental shifts that we're going to see as we start to move towards real time. But besides just the overall architecture, there's some tactical things and challenges we need to do, some technological innovations that are happening to help enable that vision. And it's not all about the fun part about the AI as well. So Jim, if we can move to the next slide, please. So let's talk about how do we get to real-time AI and the technology needs. And a lot of it has to do less with the AI itself and the things that drive AI. I think everyone in the AI and data science world knows that data is the driver of all AI activity. One of the foundational things we need to do in order to get to both real-time and real-time AI is be able to deal with the data problem that we have today. And that comes across 3 different areas. Data ingestion, being able to move large amounts of data into the right places to be able to perform the training, the learning, the model and algorithmic development, and be able to do it at speed and at scale. And that's going to require network, storage, memory, and processing architectural improvements to handle the large volumes of disparate data at speed and at scale. And that's going to be the engine, the energy that drives that engine. But one of the things that often is forgotten is that it's not just about the data, it's about having context with that data so that you can do something. A lot of the processes today rely super heavily on human labeling, on being able to take existing labels and try to model them onto others. That data management, data conditioning, data labeling, data normalization activity has to move from a manual process to an automated process. And we have to drive standards across different industries and cross-domain to enable that high-speed data management processes to happen. Because when we get that data in, if we're able to get that data in at high speed, those large data sets, we need to be able to condition it so that we can start using it quickly and not have it become a bottleneck of trying to get context into the data. Now, there's some great algorithms out there that are being tried for unsupervised and with limited data context, but really to get to real-time AI, we want to be able to have a balance of both contextual data and unstructured or non-contextual data. And that's going to require machine-based labeling. And so this is an example of using AI to help AI. Finally, we all know that data governance is important. And as we look to scale AI systems, data governance is becoming more and more important across the organization and across the industry. But one thing that hasn't been looked at is how do we get data governance at scale, at speed to support AI? We don't want the data governance functions to be a hindrance or a latency in the process. And we also don't want to have to rely on back-end resources, cloud-based governance models. We need to be able to push our governance policies and enforcements all the way out to the edge to enable real-time AI. And so that means we need to start thinking about data-centric governance, so governance that follows the data where it lives and follows the model and follows the outcomes. And it needs to be scalable edge to cloud. And that's a slightly different approach to governance, which has typically been looked at as either a documented process or a set of tools and resources that you have on the enterprise level. This is about taking that governance capabilities and deploying them just like you deploy your inferencing. And that is a slight change in how we look at data governance. And I think those innovations are going to drive the ability for us to get to real-time AI. Now, if we move to the next slide, let's talk about some of the things we need to do to make that AI happen. So now that we've got the data in the right place, we've got the training happening at speed, we've got the governance and the conditioning, how do we enable the edge to do what it needs to do to be able to perform that AI? And a lot of that has to do with pushing compute and inferencing capabilities to the pointy edge of the spear, to the very edge. A lot of times people think, well, I'm going to have an edge cloud. So you're going to take a piece of your data center, drop it out near the edge, and then connect a bunch of sensors to it. And that's a good first step, but that's just not scalable, and that doesn't get you to the real-time decision making because you're still relying on a centralized compute resource. What we're seeing today is the push to putting compute right up against the sensor. So every sensor platform is going to have compute capability to be able to perform AI inferencing, be able to make decisions and act on those insights. And we're seeing the computer power be able to be leveraged in these low SLOP environments where the size, weight, and power is commensurate with a camera, with a drone, with an MRI machine, or with a satellite in order to be able to enable that real-time AI all the way out at the edge. They've been saying for a long time that your Tesla and your other electronic vehicles are driving data centers. Your planes are flying data centers. In the future, all of your IoT devices, all of your sensor platforms are going to be mobile or fixed edge data centers. They're not going to look like the data center of old. They're going to have very compact compute capabilities, but they're going to have the power of what we used to think of as a data center. And that's going to be, again, across processing, networking, storage, and memory to enable those kind of AI transformations at the edge. Lastly, though, we need to be able to change the way we do AI. It can't always be about, well, I've got large data, I can train an AI on a large data set, deploy the inference, and get business going. We have to look at these distributed learning methods And this is just one example of a federated workflow, but being able to leverage both the edge and the back end. So your edge inferencing can happen and can update its model based on local context without relying on the cloud or back-end resources to consolidate everything. And so you can start driving real-time decision-making at the pointy edge of the spear, in this case, in the hospital, in the room, while at the same time having the results of that feed a broader workflow of federated learning across multiple different domains. So individual nodes can do the AI they need to do, and then collectively what the cloud can do is go across domain, across sensor type, and across time to give you better AI and better results that then can be pushed back out to the edge. And so it's that feedback loop that you get with federated learning is just one example of the kind of distributed learning models that we need in order to drive this next generation of real-time AI. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to Naguib, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the kinds of things that need to innovate and the kind of innovations we're already seeing to enable real-time AI to be deployed and to be scalable.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Jim, would you please? So while we're waiting for Jim, I'm Naguib Attia, VP of IBM Global University Programs. My mission is to collaborate with academia and research, as well as programs that enhance education and teaching by providing IBM technology available for free for students and researchers as well. So I'm going to talk to you today, and are you having a problem with my slide again? So I took this role, and I have a history working inside IBM. Most of my career, I was the Chief Technology Officer of the industrial sector for IBM, as well as the regional CTO for the Middle East and Africa. And finally, taking this role to link academia and universities and industries to enhance the teaching and make available technology to today's improvement in education. My talk today I'm going to bring to you, next slide, please. We already know where the data is coming from. Steve already covered a lot of landscape here, but I'm coming to you from a set of data set point that we use in our data science as well as AI courses that we provide to academia to use embedded into their teaching. And most of the data here is the data that if you say is being done as a report for 3-6 months ago, it will be changing another 3-6 months from now. But we want to bring to the attention where the data is coming from. We already saw that Steve mentioned it's coming from endpoint IoTs. It's coming from meters, it's coming from airplane, it's coming also from the single user, the person, and it's coming with all these amount of data that's surrounding us today. How can we get AI real time? With all of this work, I think we need to be more and more into the two components that will impact that. The compute power at the edge, as well as the software and the artificial intelligence algorithmic at the edge. So next slide, please. For that reason, we came in IBM with the term continuous intelligence. And as we all talk about it, is the matter of more important is that we complete the pictures with not only knowing what happened, but we need to know why. And I think this knowing why is very critical to many industries, as Steve mentioned some of them. And I will mention healthcare as well as the edge point and edge calculations, as well as artificial intelligence and the IoT sensors in many devices that working with us, we touch every day. So for IBM to do that, we created a set of industries solutions, but I'm going to talk to you today mainly about the solution called IBM Streams. And it is a decision support where it's infused the business process as well as hybrid of multi-cloud environment. And when you bring these two together, you try to fix the problem before they emerge, especially in situational like industrial, as well as the healthcare and other places. So with that, we start going into how can we improve this as well as putting more algorithm at the edge, as we call. If you bring the AI to the edge, the main two areas is what is the improvement and what is the technology direction that will help AI at the edge, as well as what is the algorithm and software capability at the edge. So next slide, please. IBM worked with the government in a research project. It's called Ibm Streams. The very high level infrastructure design is in front of us. And I don't want to go through it because it's not the point of the discussion. The point of the discussion, can a company create a platform, and that platform software can capture the data and work with the data at the edge, and in the meantime, provide the answers to what happened and why. This project is actually very well embedded now inside the IBM Weather Company, which you know that we have it, and in other areas where we use it for the Internet of Things, mainly healthcare and other industries like aerospace, automotive, electrical vehicles, as well as oil and gas and wells and oil refineries. So with this solution, you can see the very high level of what is needed to bring the AI as real at the edge. Some technologies that are already starting, and as well mentioned by Steve, I would like also to add to that, that the notion of matrix workloads and the way that the matrix workload methodology is working is also creating some movement into the real-time inference of how we can bring the AI to the edge. Another one, Steve mentioned it, which is also the federated edge. On top of this solution here, we are actually, as you already know, we try to leverage the hybrid cloud. So IBM created a suite of solution that works for the edge very quickly and very actually innovative last year because of the enablement of 5G. So we have the IBM Edge Application Manager, or the IBM Cloud Pak for network automation, or Cloud Pak for data, or the system management. So all of those solutions leverage the research backbone of IBM on AI and put this solution at the edge. I just want to bring to you that as well as we are moving forward, we try to bring all these ideas that I just mentioned to the classroom. So as part of my mission is I embed all of this discussion into some courses for AI and for data science into the classrooms in many universities that we are currently engaged with. So these technologies are open and free for you if you want to leverage. If you are in the teaching and education field, these technologies are available to you for either research or teaching, as I mentioned, from IBM. Next slide, please. As I mentioned some examples of where the streaming technology will be used, we just have it seen that healthcare, weather, IoT, as well as the electrical vehicle and aerospace. With that, pass it back to you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Naguib. So let me get set up here. While we're doing that, Simmi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So my role at Adobe is I lead several things across Adobe, and there was an intended purpose in not only leading the data governance activities, but also in leading a lot of the initiatives that are strategic in program management and in business operations and strategic planning in an organization which is in the Adobe Technology Services, and they do all analytics for Adobe internally. So we have the data lakes, we have all this data that is used to help drive the business from a data-driven operating model perspective, in addition from a near real-time customer experiences and how we push that information back not only to manage the corporate functions, but also the customer behaviors and making operational decisions about different parts of the business. So I have this really balancing role where I love to solve difficult problems. And anybody, and it's been a trajectory in my life that says, no, you can't. That's to me an opportunity for taking on a challenge and demonstrating why I think you can. I think technology is probably the easiest to cross-process and people. So obviously, what I wanted to share with you today is some of the lessons learned and some of the victories earned, as my team likes to call them. And it has not been easy. And I've been noticing some of the questions coming up in the chat. While a lot of the focus is on real time, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the pragmatic side of things. And it's more about, how do you make things happen? How do you dissect this so you can get the right sponsorship to introduce all that technology we want to do and build it in from the get-go at the point of creation of data? And how do you influence the taxonomy, the standards, the architecture pragmatically, while sneaking in the four-letter word, often data governance, into the mix without anybody even knowing it? So Jim, just moving right along if you're okay. And yeah, thank you. All right, perfect. So here's our vision from data governance. I've been with Adobe about 5 years now. And prior to that, I'll date myself and age myself if I tell you if I've been in the industry for over 20 plus years. And prior to this, I was with Salesforce as well. But one of the things I learned very early on is the IP of the future is data. And how do you apply the right standards, the right control, and how do you see where the hockey puck was going? Back when I joined Adobe, I knew that the data was being proliferated across the company, but what's the standard taxonomy? Who's accountable in the company? I often find in enterprises, there's probably a handful of people, and you may want to do this in each of your companies, is go and look at your employee system, whatever that is of choice, your human resources system, and look at how many jobs or job titles have data in them, okay? That'll give you a really good indicator of how many people actually do work with data or are somewhat accountable for data in their own orgs, in their respective area. But then how do you pull the masses of those who really do understand the data and bring them to really step up and own some of these other capabilities of the privacy, the legal, the compliance, the categorization, so that we maintain that control with the balance of near real-time decision-making and customer engagement, so you don't lose the customer, and find that right balance, right? And so the vision is really making trusted data discoverable, because if you don't know it doesn't exist, how are you ever going to do anything with it? And who is accountable for it, right? So that's really our vision, is how do we ensure that the data is secure, trusted, discoverable, and consumable? Because I don't want 16,000 versions of the same data sets across my company. That's what's causing that proliferation that you saw in the previous slides from my esteemed colleagues who just presented, right? So we got to contain it. And that's another problem. That's the next generation of problems we're solving here at Adobe, is how do you make the business more accountable for what they do? So with that, next slide, please. Sorry, I guess there was one other thing I wanted to bring up, the water. You must be thinking, what's this water? When I joined Adobe, I remember bringing this vision to fruition, and one very wise SVP asked me, hey, Simmi, so you're talking about water as the analogy. When we open a tap, we just drink the water and we know it's clean. Nobody ever questions, right? Unless you're in Flint, Michigan, I suppose. What is the quality of this water at any given tap, at any given point where we stop? And where does the water in the valley here, I'm in San Francisco Bay Area, and where does it come from? It goes through probably hundreds of miles from Hetch all the way through the various, facilities where it gets processed and cleansed and added onto and filtered before it makes it down here. So how do I know I trust it? Well, data is very similar. And the question he asked is, so are you only interested in drinking the water at the tap and knowing it's trusted? What about the journey? What about where it was sourced from? And I think the right answer is it needs to be throughout the entire life cycle of that journey. And how do you ensure that you have the right checks and balances, the right controls, and the right accountability throughout that journey. So that's the water analogy. Next slide. Thank you. So let's jump right into what I would call the search, understand, consume, and contribute framework. And you guys who are analogy buffs can probably get a little bit of my humor and why I came up with that. I'm not going to say it out loud. This is being recorded, but you can see the why. So really, at the end of the day, if you have assets that allow a catalog, I mean, I'm going right into the solutions with you as I'm speaking through this framework we've set aside, and it works. Basically, I need to be able to first understand the data, search for it, understand it in order to consume it and reuse it and not duplicate it, right? And then the ahas through whether it's AI or through data science and whatnot, I'm often training my models using that data, using those cleansed data sets, using the data sets that hundreds of people across Adobe have already used and saying, oh, this is crowdsourced. This is the right data asset I should be using to train my model because it's probably being used across so many decision-making bodies, so many reports, so many data assets that are consumed, right? So that I can train my model, come up with the next aha and contribute back, right, to the environment. So really being able to understand what the data is, how it should be used, and use it for their particular use case, and then contribute back to the ecosystem of this governed, trusted data, right? That's really what the value framework that we use that has been enabled to do this. Next slide, please, Jim. And probably to enable that framework, we've split this all up, and I think many of you may have seen this as standards into these 12 areas. But the pragmatic side of me said data governance can be many things. But when we started at Adobe, we started with just the front row of the top front three: stewardship, metadata management, and some security, privacy, and compliance, right? And then what you see in green, we continue to now add as we get successes under our belt, as we solve real business problems. Now, business problems can come from anywhere. So the real-time conversation we're having are near real-time use cases. The pragmatic side of me tells you all to think, when you're in an organization, start with a business problem. This is not a data governance problem. This is not a scale problem. This is a, what is the business problem of where I am that needs to be solved? Is it a compliance issue because we're trying to get into HIPAA or healthcare industry? Is it a compliance issue? Is it a cost reduction issue because we just can no longer scale with the number of bodies and people we're hiring in a particular ops function? Is it a revenue opportunity? We're acquiring companies left, right, and center, and we need to be able to integrate them into our mainstream products so that we can put them on the price list to be able to sell. So you see where I'm going with this. Use a business problem to help you go through and iterate on adding to these chiclets, as you see here, and then you start building muscle, you start building demonstration of value, you start having an asset catalog, you start using accountability, you now have built credibility to be able to do this across other domains, across other business problems, and much, much, much further upstream at the point of data creation to influence the taxonomy that's needed, because now you can connect the dots to how it gets used to solve those problems. Now you start addressing, saying, if we would have done at the point of creation some data lifecycle management and captured the right attributes then, boy, we would be in a much better place, wouldn't we? So I think that's really important for each of you to consider. And our data-driven operating model use case, if you haven't heard Shantanu speak to that, I encourage you to look up any of his presentations where he speaks to how we run the entire company using our own platforms, and driving our business across the customer journeys of try, buy, use, renew, using our data-driven operating model, which is all based fundamentally on data definitions, metrics, and alignment. So very important for us as Adobe, and it was a huge success for us to catapult and do this across many other use cases, which we have now started to do. Next slide, Jim. So Jim made sure, while we can talk about so many different areas, my gosh, even as my colleagues were talking, Steve and Naguib, I was thinking about 10 different things I could take this to, but I'm bringing it right back to where I've put the thoughts on. Let's just go right to the heart of it. What does it take? So here's a playbook. Here's a playbook that you can all use, that we use. And as Naguib pointed out, kind of their flow of how things work in their AI space, this is exactly how we look at every project, at every corporate initiative, multi-year, or whatever happens. And even to the smallest problem, it starts with, and this obviously, I've cleaned this up, but this was actually something we are realistically doing. As you can see, there's dates out into 2021, and we're in Q3 right now at Adobe, in our fiscal Q3 as an example, to demonstrate to you, start with the fundamental. What you learn is what you need to apply to implement this near real-time data governance capabilities here too. Requirements, right? What are the key metrics? What are the systems requiring governance? Identify those up front. That's your role. That's the role of that person with that data in their charter. We need to go make them equipped with these questions, with these lenses, so they start asking these questions as part of a project team trying to solve problems. Stewardship. Named business stewards, named technical stewards, define those early. We picked just 3 roles across Adobe that we have clearly defined. My vision for Adobe is to build those into the new hire orientation of every person that gets hired. Everybody knows what a business steward is, what a tech steward is, and or a governance champion. And it's built in from the get-go into the DNA of how we do things, is always think data. Because what's the point of creating or capturing a single piece of asset that is a data asset if you don't ask the question of, how do I plan to use it? Who's going to pay for this when I propagate it 36 million times? What's the expected rate of growth, right? There's a pragmatic side to all of this, which is cost. Don't forget that. Somebody has to pay the bill. And so onwards and forward, you can see the metrics, right? Aligning the core metrics against the core data assets. Now I'm introducing a lot of terms you may bring up and have questions on, but not every data asset needs to be treated equal. We can't govern everything. You just can't. I beg to be challenged. Can you? What's the value in it? I think you really need to figure out, do I treat this as a pragmatic problem to solve, starting with business processes or business capabilities I'm trying to mature? Or do I drive it from the back end of data-driven operating model of what KPIs, the 44 KPIs for a given profit center that matter the most, and what data assets from a lineage perspective really matter to be governed? So I think it's really important for each of you to ask, pick a tool. We picked Calibra in this instance to launch our catalog, and that's where we keep all, and it's become the system of record and the source of truth for the metadata. Systems, data, and then of course, governance, right? All of this needs to be integrated into a data lifecycle management process, and it's about having that end state also thought through. We don't need to retain data for certain things beyond 7 years, others only 4 years. Some, I would argue, especially in the area of AI, where you're trying to do things, so many models just get unattended and left and orphaned. Clean, deprecate, delete. That needs to be also part of that lifecycle management of these data assets, because that's what gives you consistency of reporting and the confidence and the data quality that's needed. Next slide, please, Jim. Specifically to the teams and what makes up those teams that do that, here's some roles that are persona-based that I've put out here, all the way from the 3 roles I pointed out, the governance champion, the technical steward, and business steward. You can see what the role of these are. This actually is built into a playbook that we have that is a recording that's sent out to many and any project. We kind of use this as an onboarding tactic. No organization I've ever been at or have partnered with or heard from really has an army of data governance people on their team. We need to figure out how to scale, be a center of excellence, and build artifacts that are really and realistic, that can be used by the project teams and team members and product area experts and data scientists. So these are roles. These are not individuals, right? Many of these roles can be played by 2 people on a team. So you need to decide who's going to play these roles. There's product owners, there's program managers as well that play a critical role in all of this journey. So it's important for you to establish these personas in these projects to go through the sequence of the steps I just laid out in the prior slide. Next slide, Jim. In conclusion, really, data governance takes a village, right? It's across all of these people who have clearly defined roles. But I think the lessons that I've learned that have brought us to success is really break silos and gain traction, right? Really, at the end of the day, you are typically going to work on data governance or activities or business problems that are cross-functional issues. Pick a nice, juicy cross-functional problem. Be bold, be brave, pick something tough, pick something everyone has tried before you and hasn't been successful in. Present solutions and options, use some methodologies like this, be adaptive, and find the balance between, is it a mandate? Do I have a top-down making it a must-do versus the carrot of here's what the benefits are of doing this, right? So find a good problem where you can do both is what I would say that's very important. Then I think across a cross-functional team and those roles and personas, if each one has them, my guess is you're going to have one person who's leaning in just a little bit more than others. There's a little bit more vested interest. Does it belong in someone's AIP or OKRs? You know, the problem you're trying to solve. Who's accountable for solving it and is going to be held accountable? Leverage it. Use it to your advantage. Get them to start being a part of that solution with you early and often, right? Learn their business, know and understand what the pain points really are, live in the shoes of and the life of. And I think it'll help each of you trying to help advance your agenda, our agenda, their agenda, which they don't even know yet. That is so critical, because if that's our future IP, if every faucet and everything where the water flows, we want to open and have clean with quality, that's where we're all trying to march towards. And this will help you work with them and demonstrate the benefit after you prove and show it, right? And then lastly, I actually kind of spoke to the last point. It's all interweaved in. But really engage directly with the stewards and champions. Don't be afraid. It's top down and bottoms up, right? There is no individual who will benefit the most. There are some people who will both ways, and you have to have people and you have to be courageous enough, and believe you me, I've gotten the reputation of hitting a lot of brick walls on my team, and I always call ourselves the small but mighty team that never gives up, right? Because we know this can be solved. It's just something that requires a lot of persistence. And so work both top down and bottom up. Thank you, Jim. Back to you.
Simmi, thank you very much. I'm just going to stop the share here. So I'd like to thank our speakers and reiterate a couple of quick points, and then we'll queue up for some questions, which I believe we have. I'm looking at some chat. So Steve started off with the concept of looking at technologies and things that we're looking at, kind of a demand side and an array of technologies that could be scaled accordingly in AI. And he hit a theme that also was reiterated, which is around the federated, kind of a governance model of edge, of moving things to the edge, and a discipline that instead of the centralized notion of governance, we are actually talking about a decentralized governance of data at the edge. That was a kind of a critical theme. Naguib then drove that further with the notion of continuous and continuous intelligence, the idea that you've got and this had been referred to in a previous 11B session, which was organized around the principle, really kind of looking at governance of what I would call the data asset stock. What we're looking at here is this notion of moving things to the point of use, to the computation and governance structure for distributed governance. And I think Naguib pointed that out and sort of reinforced some of that in terms of some use case applications. And Simmi, you kind of hit the ground running. You and I worked together over the years with kind of, okay, how do you get people to actually agree to all of this good stuff? And what is the principle? And there's a number of things that you kind of teased out in thinking through this. You've been wrestling with this for many years, as we both know. And the issue, you have personas, roles, and then coordinative activity, and then some strategic activity. And you've kind of put all of those in context with how you then reinforce that with the leadership question that you've had at Adobe, which has obviously been a very successful formula for the company over the last bunch of years. And I think those are, I'm trying to mix here some of the themes that each of our speakers have introduced, and I think we can now move to some questions. So thank you all very much for this very insightful grouping. I think we had hoped to kind of weave these themes together, and I think you guys have done a great job. So let's turn over to some of the questions. I'm looking at a chat line, and I'm not seeing.
Jim, there's questions for us at the, I believe.
Guys, are you seeing questions? I'm not seeing it on my screen here.
Yeah, here's the first one I have. Maybe I think somehow they ended up getting direct messaged. I don't know if they were intentional or not, but have you had a chance to measure the real-time effects of quantum regarding the advancements of narrow AI? Steve, is that yours?
Simple answer, we have not yet measured the effects of quantum. I think quantum is going to be a game changer on all aspects of AI. I think that's fairly clear. It's why there's a lot of excitement. I think that most of the benchmarking and work has been done on sort of the back end side. We don't really have a portable quantum capability yet, but I think that there will be some really interesting innovations of being able to get to real-time AI when you have the compute capacity that a quantum system, a practical quantum system provides. So stay tuned, there are more interesting things to come.
So here's a, sorry.
Go ahead, Jim. No, go ahead, Jim. There were a few others. I think somehow they got just to me. So whenever we're,
Okay.
I think, yeah, there's a few more. There's lots of questions, so please go ahead.
Okay, well, unfortunately, maybe if I switch, but here's one that has been sent to all panelists. And maybe everyone, well, I get myself organized on receiving some of the chat questions. So Professor Young has asked the question, how can a company create a platform for all of these different models? You know, we talk a lot about platforms in today's in IT world. And an example is show risk models for upstream and downstream operations, as well as their data collection of millions of users pumping gas. So the notion that you have upstream, downstream business, and the notion that somehow you could create a platform that merges these large dimensionalities of the business, obviously in the oil and gas industry, of the traditional models of bringing things in and then distributing it to the customers. So and this was to each of you. So Naguib, can we ask you?
Let me take a stamp at this, especially I used to be the CTO of the upstream, downstream for oil and gas for IBM.
I remember that.
Right. The two issues we need to be a little bit careful. The downstream is really a more distributed systems because of the end point, which is the pump at the end, and all of those from refinery to including the we already know the pipelines and the flow of assets within pipelines to reach the gas station. I think, and I love this question, because this question is actually like, let's work together and build a solution, because it didn't exist. It has to come, the company need it, and a platform can be built based on some other experiences that's possibly happening as we speak with the weather company or the other projects. But this is really a point because if I may remember, what 15 years ago, I had an issue with a pipeline issues with a gas company in the country, where the problem was the siphoning of the oil out, what they call it, the out of the pipeline through the trip between the refinery to the distribution centers. So these things now, the edge point calculate IoT and edge compute with AI will really solve a lot of these problems. So I understand this problem. Reach out to me and I'll get you with the right team that can work with you on this.
And
Jim, we have enough? Yeah.
I was going to, now that I can actually read the questions, I'm taking another look at the quantum one. And so there was a very specific ask in there, is how is the quantum going to impact narrow AI versus where I think some of the futurists are thinking that quantum will also impact some of the other forms, so general and strong AI. Again, I think that the key here is that the capacity and capability that quantum brings to bear when it's fully realized is going to make a lot of the narrow AI, I mean, obviously much faster, but I think we're only skimming the tip of the iceberg on what the opportunity is there. We still keep thinking in today's term, like narrow AI is a today term, and it's the models that are built with today's computer architectures. What we haven't started doing, or some researchers have done, but we haven't seen practical applications of yet, is where we build narrow styled use cases using quantum-based AI. There's where the game change happens, where it's not trying to get today's models to run faster. We're building whole new approaches based on tomorrow's architectures. That's where the real benchmarks of getting to real-time and predictive capabilities of quantum advances really start to shine. It's not just of, well, how do we make stuff we do today faster? It's how do we build things for this new world where we haven't even conceived of the architecture that's necessary.
Steve, I'm going to ask you to keep on a roll here because we have a question that really is in your space, which is, it's one thing to talk about edge, but how do you overcome and address security challenges with edge computing?
So it's a great question, and everyone thinks that the edge is less secure than the cloud, or that the edge is less secure than the network or anything else. Everything is insecure until you secure it. I think that the challenge that people are thinking about is edge computing doesn't have a lot of the same controls like physical protections, guards with guns, and system administrators that your cloud and data center has. The good news is that the technology has not been sitting idle. The hardware vendors, the OEMs, and the software vendors have developed security technologies to advance the art around physical protections and sensors to protect the applications and data at the edge, whether it be memory encryption technologies, tamper protection technologies, root of trust technologies. These are built in to a lot of these edge compute platforms. The key for each organization that's evaluating pushing compute to the edge is to make sure that you leverage those hardware features and those software capabilities that are available now that are oftentimes not turned on. And so I would posit the question back is, how are you enabling edge security in your environment? How are you specifying in your procurements that you have the right features like secure boot, data protection, tamper protection, and audit and logging turned on and available for you? So the answer is we can get there. The technology exists. This doesn't need to be developed. We have the technology today, but oftentimes it doesn't get leveraged.
And Jim, I like to take a little bit of a slight add to what Steve, if you don't mind what you said,
Sure.
is don't forget the data lifecycle management component and bringing in your legal privacy compliance team members as part of your solution team. This doesn't have to be only a technical problem and solved with all of the technical vendors and solutions out there. There's an architecture component that you drive, but when you bring your security team members into the solution of here's the business problem of why I need to push to the edge, here is what controls, capabilities, and services I will put around this data, which is the most needing to be the most secure. Partner with me to help solve this business problem. You believe you me, when you do that, you start getting this leaning in of how legal, privacy, compliance all work in partnership with you to make the goal happen, because it's everyone's goal.
I completely agree. And I would actually add, in my experience, oftentimes developers want to have everything available all the places. And so they don't really think through what's important to have on those devices. In those conversations, when I bring those two organizations together and they start saying, well, you know what, this data here has a privacy component, this data here has a compliance component, they stop and they think, well, do I really need that data? And that question alone makes the whole world easier, because if you don't have to secure it to that high degree, you can actually do a lot more. And so sometimes having the conversation gets you to start thinking about, do I have least privilege involved here? Do I make sure that I have the right data, not just all the data being available on those systems? So that's a great comment, Simmi.
So we have one question that's a good closing question. I think we're starting to run against our time limit here. One, we've got about two minutes left. Thank you for that prompt. And we do have a closing question that we can have everyone comment on. And if everyone restricts it to sort of 45 seconds a minute. And of course, we saved the easiest question for last, which is, how does real-time correlate with the legal and ethical use of data? So we talked a little bit about legal. So obviously we can't have, law is not known as a real-time activity, right? It's procedurally driven, and it's a contested activity. People contest legal principles. That's the whole part of the concept. So how do these ideas square with what people are talking about with respect to ethical use and law regarding artificial intelligence in real time? So Naguib, do you want to take that?
I was going to say, I like this question because it actually came with the keynote speaker yesterday and the Ron call. And this is exactly where some companies, we have a big focus group of research for ethical AI. And that is where we're going to bring, can we really put the ethical rule or use of data and the AI, and can we, because the legal issue is illegal, you can put it, but where are the ethical? What measures were you put to say this is ethically used correctly? And I like what was mentioned yesterday in the keynote speaker. This is exactly where all the AI people who are working in this field need to pay attention to. Are we developing algorithms that pay attention to the ethical rules of use of data?
Thank you, Naguib.
Thank you.
Steve, you want to comment on that from the CTO side of things?
Sure. And so I think I'm going to set Simmi up a little bit here. It's going to take governance to make that happen, and deploying governance to the edge. So how do you do real-time AI that's still ethical and legal? You have to build that in. You have to build in those controls into your deployments, and you have to have the right policies implemented and enforced. And so that's how you do it. The bigger question is, can we do it? And I think some of that is that it's going to stress our legal systems, because like you said, real-time decisions have to be made in real time. You can't rely on a legal debate or a courtroom. It's going to be made and then someone's going to discuss it after. And so I think that the mechanism is there. We can deploy the governance capabilities and enforcements out to the edge. But a lot of it's going to be, how do we build the right ethical models and the legal frameworks to support that kind of enforcement point so that you can make a decision. And I think part of the challenge is often the data scientists and the researchers get wrapped around the trolley experiment. And that's not a great, I mean, it's a great model for thinking about AI and ethical use, but at the end of the day, it's not a great model because there's no good choice. And so what I would say is we need to have a legal framework that enables the use of real-time AI, and then we can use the technology to deploy that governance capabilities at scale.
So Simmi, can you wrap this up very quickly? We're actually right on time. So you
Absolutely.
introduce.
Yes, so we can talk more later. You can reach out to me if you want to talk about this. This is where I spend a lot of my time, and Steve, you did set me up. Get yourself a governance team. Get yourself a strong governance component and an arm that brings together the developers, the product managers, the business folks, the legal, compliance, security, outside in. Bring together the right framework, bring together the right people to make these decisions, define what ethical use of data even means within your organization, because it means different things for different people. Use the compliance laws that are already in place, whether it's CPIR, GDPR, there's some that are already coming. You already have that head start. but start to pull together the right team with someone focused on it, because if you want it done, you have to have someone whose job it is to make sure it happens.
Okay, I want to thank everyone, and I want to thank all of you who participated. I certainly want to thank our speakers, and I want to thank the conference chairs and Professor Shung for introducing our session. I know we're slightly over, so we're going to close up here very quickly so that all of you can move on to the next session. So thank you all very much. This has been a great session. We've really enjoyed presenting. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I do appreciate it. We would like to express a sincere appreciation to our distinguished panelists for sharing their view and their experience. Thank you. And also, I'd like to thank all those in the audience who participated, who attended this session. Just a programming note, the next session will begin at 4:35. So in matter of a few minutes. So thank you for attending this session.